Hello, this is your Access Criminology module, lecture number 7, exploring further psychological theories, to replace the lecture that the breakdown on the trains prevented me from actually getting into for you. So, in terms of expanding upon some of the psychological theories we touched on last time we met, we'll flesh out the ideas around behaviorism and social learning theories a little bit more and go more deeply into cognitive theories and the notions around dysfunctional thinking patterns. We'll also touch a little bit on humanistic psychology, which we mentioned very briefly towards the end of the previous lecture. Now, in terms of this third wave, as hopefully you'll remember we called it, of psychology, first wave being Freud's psychodynamic theory, and the second wave being behaviorism. Humanistic psychology came along as the third wave, putting a great emphasis on the idea of human goodness, creativity, inventiveness, resourcefulness, intelligence, the need to live a good, positive, upbeat life. All of which may seem somewhat at odds with a module around criminology, given that crime, generally speaking, is the antithesis of a good, upbeat, creative life. But they had some views which have a bearing upon the issue of crime. The two chaps in the photograph are Abraham Maslow on the left and Carl Rogers on the right there. And we'll mention Carl Rogers momentarily. But just briefly to flag up, first of all, Alfred Adler, who had begun life as a student of Sigmund Freud, very influenced by Freudian notions and Freudian ideas, but gradually moved further and further and further away from Freud and became more identified with humanistic thought and psychology. Not fully, but certainly he overlaps into the realm of humanistic psychology, and certainly had this notion that human experience should be very positive, very dynamic, very fulfilling, and that the happy, healthy mind should be a very open, very positive one. I had a German concept, Gemeinschaftsgefühle, which describes the need for this sort of positive, engaged life, where people love nature, they love their fellow humans, at least in the abstract sense, if not in any deeper sense, and they want the best for people, and they work for the good of the community, and quite opposite to the sort of very selfish, very destructive characteristics that's often found both in the criminally inclined, but also, it has to be said, in some of the more financially successful individuals within things like city trading and clambering up the corporate ladder, often are very driven, very self-obsessed individuals. So the traits that can lead to great material success, if not necessarily to inner happiness, can also lead into a life of crime, at least from Adler's point of view. So some of his other ideas that he mentions, he says we're all born with what is translated into English, bearing in mind he was German and writing in German, as the will to power. Now that makes it sound slightly maniacal, as if somehow everyone wants to be this domineering little monster. It doesn't quite mean like that, power in the sort of tyrannical, domineering sense. What he really means is we all have this urge to control our own lives, to be in charge of our own destinies, to have a sense of purpose and authority as to where we're going in the world, rather than feeling at the mercy of other people. So this will to power is a will to independence, really, in a sense. So we all want to stake our claim on the world, and he says, ideally, we should all do this in a very positive, very pro-social, very upbeat way. But often that's difficult because of circumstances in our upbringing, sometimes in our biology, a whole raft of factors that might damage and dent an individual's capacities. And so you often get people who have felt very thwarted in life, have felt very damaged, as if either they don't know what they want in life, or whatever it is that they did want has been denied them and refused them, and they've been maybe denigrated because they haven't fit in quite the way that other people, their family, their friends, etc., have wanted them to. And this, he says, tends to warp people. By denying someone's will to independence and authority and control over themselves, they still have those urges, but they tend to manifest in very damaged and damaging ways. One particular form of manifestation is in terms of overcompensation. So someone who feels very weak and limited in one area of their life may overcompensate in another by becoming potentially very, very domineering, very bullying, very controlling, very overbearing. It can manifest in other ways as well, but that's one way that's particularly relevant to the issue of crime. And so you might end up with someone who feels very weak in themselves, but compensates by going out and dominating somebody else. Now, they could do that in business, they could do that in family life, in all sorts of different ways, but equally they could go and beat somebody up and make them feel weak by punching them to the floor and making them afraid, making them cower. They could do it by killing somebody. They could do it by abducting and abusing, torturing somebody. So there's all sorts of horrible ways in which someone could feel powerful in a very destructive, ugly sort of a way, which Adler says is a compensation for the fact that deep down they feel very weak, very vulnerable because of various things that have happened to them over the course of their life. And they, rather than trying to control their own life, they start controlling other people's lives in harmful, destructive ways. At the root of this is what he referred to as the inferiority complex, which is an idea that's gone very mainstream. Lots of people have heard of inferiority complexes, even if they've never heard of Alfred Adler. Someone who feels very inferior, largely because they've been made to feel inferior. So Adler's argument is that people don't naturally feel inferior. They don't just wake up one morning and suddenly start feeling inferior. This is something they're made to feel over years and years of being bullied and abused and denigrated and insulted and treated like dirt and denied position, treated as if their opinions don't count, treated as if they're not worth anything. Now that could be that they're treated in that way by family members or by friends. It could be treated that way by an employer. It could be treated that way by a government. You could be born into a society where the sort of person you are is not given much credence. So let's say you're born as a woman in early Victorian society where women had very little political control over anything. They couldn't vote, their opinions weren't generally consulted, they were meant to obey their husbands and so on. There were other ways in which women could establish their importance and significance, but the government of the day treated women as second-class citizens. Like was let's say a black person living in apartheid South Africa, going back a few decades now, was very much treated as a second-rate citizen. So it could be a family thing, or it could be a society-wide phenomenon where an individual is made to feel irrelevant and worthless, and so tends to lash out, partly through destructiveness, but also, Adler says, through a wish to try and feel superior. So the key is that a healthy mind would feel equal to other people. That I'm not better than you, but equally I'm not worse than you. That we are all decent people and of value and so on and so forth. Whereas an unhealthy mind either feels very worthless and inferior and weak and downtrodden, or equally rages and rants and roars and tries to be very domineering and overbearing and overcompensate by making themselves feel much more important than all of the people around them. Which isn't automatically a criminal issue, but it could easily tip over into various different forms of crime, where someone is harming and maiming and lording it over others like a mafia boss, that kind of thing, in order to feel incredibly important and very powerful and superior and so on. Carl Rogers, the chap in the right-hand photograph, said that in a similar sort of vein, everyone needs to feel wanted and valued. he phrased it as positive regard, and usually that begins in the family, but it can extend to the sorts of things we're just talking about with women in Victorian society, black people in apartheid South Africa and so on, where someone may be made to feel worthless by wider society rather than necessarily by immediate family or circles of friends or employers or whatever. None of those options are healthy options. If it happens, it happens once. Everyone will have that experience at some point in their life where somebody else is very rude and abusive towards them. If it's a one-off thing, you can shrug it off and think, what an idiot, and move on from it. But if it's relentless, it happens again and again and again and again, it wears you down. And eventually, Roger says, it starts to internalise, in that you start to feel you must be worthless because everyone keeps treating you as if you're worthless. You must be irrelevant because people keep telling you that you're irrelevant, that you don't matter, you don't count, you're nothing special, you're a nuisance or whatever. Probably something much ruder than that. But the constant drip, drip, drip of nastiness permeates into the individual, especially if it starts when they're very young and their defences aren't well established. What tends to happen is that an individual moves from having positive regard, where they feel loved and wanted and so on, to having what Rogers calls conditions of worth. And that's something that tends to be more an issue within families and friendship circles than it is in government circles. Largely because it's when a person, let's say it's a parent, for argument's sake, a parent says to a child, I will love you, but only if. And the only if could be if you get good grades in school, or if you become the star football player on the team, or if you do something. Well, obviously that could go to some really grim, horrible, abusive areas where we know from court records and so forth that there are parents who will persuade their children to do some horrendously awful things and tell them this is love and that they must accept what they're given, and if they don't, or if they report the parent for the abuse, then the parent won't love them anymore, and essentially what Rogers is arguing, that there is this fundamental need in young children to be loved by their parents particularly, but also others, aunts, uncles, grandparents, etc. And children will put up with almost anything in order to win love and affection. Partly it's an evolutionary survival instinct. But as we get older, and we are capable of surviving on our own, to a point at any rate, nonetheless we still have this significant part of our character that will put up with no end of abuse. So it may start with a parent who is abusive, but then once you're growing up as an adult, it could be a husband or wife, a work colleague, an employer, a friend, a variety of people who treat you very, very badly and say, you've got to do this for me, you've got to do that for me, you've got to put up with this, you've got to put up with that, otherwise I won't love you anymore. And they might not put it as bluntly as that, but the implication is that your value is dependent on you jumping through certain hoops, doing certain things, putting up with certain things. And if you don't put up with them or do those things, you become a worthless individual in the eyes of that person. And so the one on the receiving end of all this learns to put up and endure and engage in what they are bullied and pressured into engaging in, even if they don't really want to do it deep down. And that potentially could include crime. So you could get someone who, in order to please a friendship group, we're talking about people who are easily led, that the friends bully them into, it could be low-level crime like shoplifting, all the way up to much, much more serious things. And in order to win the approval of the group, the youngster, usually a youngster, will go along with all manner of things and engage in more and more criminal activities to please a more domineering character. Incongruity is the feeling of wrongness that people get when they... Roger says we all have this inner self, a true self, an authentic true self. And when you are in harmony, you kind of let your real self out, you feel authentic, you feel real, you feel good. When you fake it, when you learn to put on a mask and pretend to be something you're not, because you've been bullied into it, pressured into it, etc., then what you experience inside is incongruity, this feeling of wrongness. And after you've been living that kind of life for years and years and years, you may get to the point where you're no longer really sure why you feel wrong, why things feel incongruent, because you've been doing it for so long. You sort of forgotten what you were really like before you started faking it in order to please somebody else, before you started pretending to be someone you're not. So if it's a long-term thing, you can really lose sight of your inner self. So you live with the feelings of wrongness, even though you can't pinpoint down in a conversation with a therapist or with whoever it might be quite why you feel wrong. You just know that you do. And whilst that's more likely to raise up in sort of family situations and domestic situations, it could potentially include criminal situations as well. Leaving humanism to one side, unless you've got any questions you want to email across to me or raise in the next class, well, we'll revisit behaviourism a little bit. Behaviourism, as you remember, is this rather carrot and stick approach to training not only poor old donkeys there in the picture, but also human beings. That the carrot is the reward dangled in front of you to get you to do things, and the stick is the punishment, the painful experience that happens if you do the wrong thing. And so by a combination of reward and punishment, people are steered into certain forms of behaviour pattern. The job of the behaviourist is to work out what the carrot is and what the stick is, and how these are leading to certain forms of behaviour for that particular individual that they're studying. And hopefully you'll remember from previous weeks these various factors that are listed on the screen that are necessary. People like Albert Bandura, Skinner, various others, said these factors were necessary to help shape behaviour effectively. So chronological adjacency is the posh way of saying a quick response. So you do something and you're very quickly punished, or you're very quickly rewarded. Slow punishments and slow rules, in other words, things that happen days or weeks or months or even years after you've done the behaviour, don't really work very well, because it's so far removed in time from the behaviour that it doesn't form much of an association. So whether it's a reward or a punishment, it needs to be quick. It needs to happen very soon after the particular behaviour in question. Repetition is this notion that the reward or the punishment must happen quite often. It doesn't have to happen every single time, but it has to happen often enough to form an association. So you get punished often enough for doing the wrong thing, or rewarded often enough for doing the right thing, that you'll keep on doing it. If the punishments stop happening or the rewards stop happening, then eventually the behaviour, the pattern associated with those behaviours becomes extinct, which is to say the behaviour ceases to be. So it's that behavioural pattern will die out and cease to be an issue for the individual who's being conditioned, which is the term favoured by behaviourists. You could say trained, but behaviourists tend to say conditioned. Hopefully you remember all of the differences between positive reward and negative reward and so forth. Positive reward is giving somebody a thing that they do want, like the carrot for the donkey. Negative reward is taking away from them something very unpleasant, something they don't want. So you might remember the situation with Seligman and the dog experiment, which we mentioned very briefly 2 weeks ago, I think it was now, where he put an electric current through the metal floor of a cage that the dogs were in, and if they moved to a different part of the cage, the current was turned off, and so they learned to move away to avoid the unpleasant experience, the painful experience, and learned where to sit in the cage. There's a bit more to his experiment than just that, but that's the idea of both positive and negative rewards. Bandura, Skinner, various other people have said that reward for most individuals is more effective than punishment. Clearly that's not going to be the case for every single person, but by and large you're more likely to induce a behaviour pattern if you reward good behaviour than if you punish bad behaviour. Edwin Sutherland we mentioned the other week as developing differential association theory. Back in the 30s and 40s he was studying criminal neighbourhoods in America where lots and lots of people were engaged in crime in the same district, and youngsters were drawn into crime, and he developed these ideas that those youngsters were being trained in the skills required of them to commit various different types of crime. These days it could be, obviously that was the 30s and 40s, but if you think of a really rough neighbourhood in somewhere in Suffolk today, the types of skills they might be learning could be computer hacking, it could be how to manufacture different types of drugs and weigh them and bag them and deal with them and what prices to charge for them. There could be a whole raft of different types of crimes that somebody might be learning in terms of which particular skill set goes with that crime. But more important than that, Sutherland and associated theorists said it's also an issue of learning motivations. Not only learning how to do the crime, but learning why. So why could be you make a lot of money from drug dealing, so you learn, you can go buy the cars and flash clothes and this and that and the other. So it could be learning those sorts of motivations. But also part of it is not just I'm committing this crime because it's going to get me money. It's also learning a sort of moral, or if you prefer an immoral, justification for committing that crime. So why should I sell heroin to that person over there? Maybe the justification is that that person over there is a useless, worthless individual. And yes, they might get ill, and they might die, and they might overdose, and they might have a terrible, miserable life from using the heroin, but they're not a worthwhile person, whereas the money the drug dealer gets off of them, they say to themselves, well, this is worth, it's more important that I have this money than that person over there, the customer, has a good life, so they can just suffer. So it's learning the justifications for committing those sorts of actions, those sorts of crimes, which, going more deeply into Sutherland's theory, can be quite complex forms of justification and rationalisation and so on. A lot of crime, he said, is very opportunistic. There's not much planning involved. It's just kind of somebody walks into a shop, the shopkeeper turns their back, and they just grab something off the shelves and stuff it in their pocket. There's very little planning involved. You're not looking at Professor Moriarty with convoluted crime plans most of the time. When it comes to changing behaviour, if you like, unlearning to be a criminal, somebody's in prison and they're going through a form of rehab of some sort to change their behaviours. Sutherland and a whole raft of other behaviourists and theorists, although Sutherland was more sociologist than a behaviourist, but his arguments fit in with the behaviourist model as well, argued that it's much more effective to reward the kinds of behaviour you would like that individual to engage in the community than simply to punish their criminal behaviour. So locking them up and putting them in prison or doing some other horrible thing to them is not enough in and of itself to stop the behaviour. If you can teach them how to make money legally, that's more effective. If you can teach them a better view of the world, a more socially productive view of the world, that's more effective than just punishment. Skinner here, one of his most famous books, going back to 71, was called Beyond Freedom and Dignity. He did write a lot of books and a lot of research journals and papers and so on. But this was one of his most famous ones. In that particular book, he said that there isn't really such a thing as free will and choice and individualism. It's better to understand humans en masse rather than to think of them as individuals, or even to think of ourselves as individuals, let alone this notion of studying other people. That we are easily conditioned, easily persuaded, and easily manipulated into doing things. So we think quite often we're doing things out of free choice. So I'm sitting here talking to the computer because I think I want to do it at this time. That's the illusion I'm living under. Whereas Skinner, if he was still alive, would say, no, you've been conditioned to do this, you're rewarded to do it, you've got a pay packet, and there's always the threat that if you don't do it, there might be negative consequences for your employment. And so the notion that I am engaging in free will to do this and to talk about these particular subjects, these particular theorists, is exactly that. It's an illusion. So for Skinner, we are all rather like well-trained dogs in a circus doing tricks. We think we're doing it from choice, but we're not really. As far as he was concerned, people keep going on and on, like the humanists do, about free will and choice was just clouding the issue and preventing society from ever developing into a more harmonious, happy whole that would do away with crime by taking on board his behaviourist principles and applying them to everybody. Not just to prisoners, to everybody. He got a lot of criticism for saying that, but he said it anyway. So this quote from Skinner: a person who has been punished is not thereby simply less inclined to behave in a given way. At best, he learns how to avoid punishment. And this again is his argument that reward is better than punishment, because punishment doesn't work terribly well. In the short term, you shout at the child for doing something wrong, or smack them, or whatever the punishment may be, and they get upset, and so they don't do it, at least when you're around to watch. And this is what he's saying. It's less about the child who's been punished. Do they learn to stop doing the behaviour ever again, or do they learn to just not do it in such a way that you'll catch them doing it? Because it's the punishment they want to avoid rather than stop engaging in the naughty behaviour. So they'll still do the naughty thing, they'll just do it when they're not looking. Or do it in such a way where they don't think they'll get caught. So it's not terribly effective. So if we transfer that from talking about naughty children to thinking about naughty adults, criminally inclined adults, how should a society respond to badly behaved adults? Is it effective to put them in prison, or like they do in some parts of the world, chop off their hand, or whip them, or some other equally grim thing? Is that a really effective way of stopping their criminal behaviour? Skinner would say no. He'd say you put them in prison, or you tie them up and flog them, depending on which bit of the world we're in. And it's a horrible experience, and they hate you for it, and what they learn is to avoid getting caught. So they may still go on being a criminal, they're just trying to be a criminal in a more clever way, so that they don't get subject to that punishment again in the future. So you need to come up as a society with something better than punishment. And this would be an interesting opportunity for you. You could pause the video, you could mull it over, have a coffee, think about it, jot down some ideas on a bit of scrap paper and bring them up in the next class, or via an email, as the case may be, whatever you prefer. How would the criminal justice system, the CJS, have to change? We'll stick to this country. So we've got about countries where they whip people and chop their hands off and so forth. Let's just think about this country. So we have prisons, we have fines, we have community service, various different kinds of punishment that are dished out for different types of offence. What could change to make the way we as a society respond to crime more effective in terms of reducing the criminal behaviour of adults? You could also have a think about how parents could better raise their kids, how school teachers could better discipline the children in schools and so on. But particularly, of course, because this is a criminology module, to think about it in a criminal context. If prison doesn't work terribly well, at least in terms of changing behaviour, it may work in other ways, like taking a dangerous person off the streets. But if it's not changing the behaviour long term, would there be a better way of changing the behaviour long term? Skinner's argument is that rewarding good behaviour would be the more effective thing to do. But would that work? So let's say you've got someone who's mugged a pensioner, bashed them, stole their wallet and went off with it. You don't want them to go around mugging pensioners or any other age group ever again. How would you stop them mugging? Would rewarding them for earning an honest living be socially acceptable? Would it work, even if it's not socially acceptable? How would you go about encouraging them to give up their life as a mugger and become something a bit better? A more decent sort of a person? Something to mull over and think about anyway. So Skinner's argument is that governments, if they bought his book and read it and believed his prescriptions for running society, they would engage in social engineering, or cultural engineering if you prefer. So they would try to change human behaviour, and they do anyway. But obviously they don't do it in terribly effective ways, otherwise there would be far fewer criminals in the country than there are. So he'd like governments to take on board behaviourist principles of reward and punishment and conditioning behaviour, shaping behaviour, to create this society where everyone is well behaved and does what you need them to do. That does assume, of course, the people in charge of setting the rewards and punishments are themselves operating from the best interests of society and not in a very dubious and dodgy way themselves, but that's a slightly separate issue. Someone from the sociological rather than the psychological or criminological side of the argument, Antonio Gramsci, argued that societies do this to a point anyway, but one of the methods they do it is through the utilisation of media. Now we'll come back to Gramsci in next week's lecture when we start looking at sociological arguments and theories. But he suggests that the mass media, films, TV, newspapers, the radio, the internet these days, although he was dead long time before the internet existed, but these various phenomena are ways of shaping how people think. But they're not shaped in a cohesive way. So a newspaper owned by Rupert Murdoch may be trying to shape people's minds in one way, whereas a newspaper owned by Lord Rothermere might be trying to shape people's minds in a different way. For Skinner, the government should be the central force, not all these competing rival forces. There should be one centralised force, the government, which is shaping people's minds in one direction, rather than 20 different competing individuals and billionaires and what have you, trying to shape people's minds in 20 different directions. That's why there is so much conflict, because there's so many competing messages and contradictory messages. What he would like would be one harmonious message. So the rewards and punishments aren't just things like prisons and giving people money. It includes the sorts of factors that Gramsci is talking about, of social conditioning by things you see in films, on television, things you read in the newspapers, which shape how we think about the world by encouraging certain behaviours and discouraging others. Seeing things happen to other people, even if those other people are fictional people, or in a film, nonetheless has a shaping effect on the consumers of mass media. You could argue to a point there's already plenty of very obvious examples of social engineering going on, and we can discuss some of those as we go along. For example, I can assure you I don't get a free bag of chips for talking about McCain's oven chips, but some of you may have seen their advert, or a whole series of adverts actually. McCain's have been advertising for years, but their most recent set of adverts, some of them have this tag phrase, "We are family," and some of them have a catchphrase about love and defining love. And so you get lots of different types of family. So there's lesbian couples, there's mixed race couples, there's couples which include at least one half of the couple who's disabled. There's all sorts of different families, the kind of diversity focused notions of family, rather than, let's say, the kinds of family you would have seen in a TV advert back in 1980. Would have been mum, dad, 2.4 kids, and probably all white. Maybe once in a blue moon a black or an Asian family, but almost entirely white families. Whereas McCain's is going out of its way to include lots of diversity issues in their adverts. Now, are they doing this solely to sell chips? Because they want more black people, Asian people, disabled people, gay couples, whatever, to go and buy their chips? Maybe they do. Maybe they're trying to expand their market of customers, because possibly they didn't think many people from those backgrounds were buying chips before. I don't know what the marketing issues there are. But maybe it's also because they want to appeal to younger viewers who feel very impassioned about issues of political correctness. And so even if those viewers aren't disabled or gay or from different ethnic minorities, they will still nonetheless think, yay, good on McCain oven chips, putting gay couples and whatnot in their adverts. I will go out and buy a bag of chips because of that. Or is it nothing to do with chips? Is this an attempt to get viewers to think, yes, there are all these different types of families in the world, and this is a good thing, and this should be mainstreamed, rather than being, as, again, if we go back to, say, 1980s, where you'd be much less likely to see any of these sorts of people in adverts, or indeed very many people of these different backgrounds in telly generally, not just adverts in other areas too. And clearly there were black and Asian actors, and you had gay people appearing in films and so on, or gay characters, I should say, appearing in films, but less often, and not always in a very positive light. Whereas this advert here is going out of its way to put things in a very positive light. So is this social engineering? If it is, then this is a question for you to mull over. Again, maybe a cup of coffee, think about it, bounce your ideas around next time we're talking together. Is it desirable that social engineering is being engaged in by a chip making company, as opposed to, say, the government or the church or a newspaper or a TV station? There's endless sorts of institutions in the world that could be engaging in promoting issues and understandings of what constitutes family life, what's desirable behaviour, what's undesirable behaviour, what's a good family life to have, what's a bad family life to have. All sorts of institutions could be putting out these messages, and indeed do. Why is a chip company doing it? Someone with a very, let's say, hardline business mind might say the job of a chip company is to sell chips and nothing else. Why are they getting engaged in social issues when they should just be talking about how lovely their chips are and that sort of thing? It's a curious one in that we are now in the 21st century seeing a much wider array of organisations engaging in social engineering than ever used to. Razor blade companies, chip companies, all sorts of companies manufacturing things that want to put a social message across. And often, possibly you may or may not agree with me on this one, I frequently find myself watching adverts and I've got absolutely no idea what the hell it is they're selling, because they're so wrapped up in putting their social message across, you kind of lose track of the actual product that they're trying to get you to buy. Is that a problem? If it is a problem, it's a problem maybe for business functioning rather than anything else. But who would you want to engage in social engineering? Do you want your society engineered by the government, by the church, by private businesses, by charities, by schools? Or would you prefer they all minded their own business and let you live the way you want to live without having sermons given to you by chip companies or by anybody else for that matter? What's your take on this? Now, obviously this is all about family life rather than about crime and so on, but by extension, what you say, if a message is put across effectively on one topic, a different message on a different topic could also be put across effectively. So you could have adverts or social media campaigns or whatever else directed towards criminal issues and criminal behaviours and changing criminal behaviours rather than around issues of family. What works well in one sense doesn't always work well in another. Now, the media, you could say, does indeed shape our notion of crime and our notion of justice and of order in all sorts of different ways and different directions. So old Hercule Poirot up there, whether he's on film or in the books or on TV shows, he always gets the criminal at the end. And there's certainly sociologists who argue that the reason crime novels are enormously popular, they are one of the biggest selling genres of fiction, is that by and large the detective always wins. So you have murder and mayhem and rape and robbery and Lord knows what else going on, but the goodie, the detective, always gets the baddie at the end. And that's why we like it, because these works of fiction establish a sense of order, a sense of, yes, bad things happen, but in the end they're put right. And they are put right by police officers, by clever detectives, by barristers, by whoever that particular work of fiction happens to be about. So Poirot is upholding law and order and justice. Speaking of law and order, I don't know how many of you have seen that particular series. It's been off air for a while now, except on the nostalgia channels where it plays quite regularly. Law and Order UK is a much grimmer view of the judicial system. It deals with both the police and the courtrooms. Lots of quite horrendous crimes, and unlike Poirot, they don't always succeed in convicting the baddies, because they deal with a much more nuanced sense of the problems faced in courts. In fact, sometimes the baddies get off, and sometimes the innocent get convicted or subjected to even further levels of abuse than they were previously, like in rape trials and things like that. So it's quite a dark, bleak view of the legal system, but maybe a much more realistic one, to a point at any rate, than perhaps Poirot, who always gets the baddie. Does that give us a more jaded view? So if you had watched, let's say you were a victim of crime and you watched an episode of Law and Order and the baddie got away with it and the witnesses and the victims were put through the ringer in the trial and they suffered because of it, would you then want to go to the police and report the crime that had happened to you? If you'd just seen a show like that and you were thinking, oh, is this going to happen to me? Am I going to be put through the ringer? Is the person who's committed this crime against me, are they going to get off? So that, again, that could shape people's understanding of what constitutes law and order, because the vast majority of people will have very little contact with courts during their lifetime. We'll see far more fictional courts on TV and in films than we'll ever actually, unless you are professionally involved in the criminal justice system, you're highly unlikely to have much contact with the police, much contact with barristers and judges and the rest of it, because most people don't. The closest experience they have of the criminal justice system is watching TV shows. On the flip side, we have Peaky Blinders, obviously a historical period piece, of gangsters, but gangsters portrayed in a more positive light. There are grim things that happen in that series, but they're very stylish. The actors are often very good looking. Not all of them, clearly, but there's a sort of a glamour to them, a charm to them, and there's also a sense of rough justice through that series. The notion that they will often dispense their own form of justice rather than bothering with the police and law and order. So when they see someone crossing the line and engaging in really unacceptable criminal behaviour, they'll be the ones to go around and beat them up or kill them or do whatever thing they're going to do to them. So even though they are criminals themselves, they're maintaining a kind of rough, brutal order in the communities they operate in by drawing the line between what they class as acceptable crime and what they class as unacceptable crime. And it's an attitude, certainly something I remember growing up with. the views of people around, say, the Cray twins in London and comparable thugs in other parts of the country, who, yes, they were engaged in crime and they were not nice people, but often there was a kind of a grudging admiration amongst the wider public that these rather thuggish figures would keep a form of order in their communities. So if there was a child molester, for example, they'd go and deal with him, usually in a very violent fashion. Or if there was someone mugging lots of frail old ladies, which would have been seen as an unacceptable crime to people like the Cray twins, then they would track them down and break their kneecaps or do something equally brutal and put a stop to it. So that they were kind of a form of justice, but a very unofficial form of justice. And again, does that shape people's ideas of, if you are a victim of crime, who do you turn to? Do you turn to the police? Do you turn to a private detective like Poirot? Do you turn to that gangster who lives a few streets over and you bung them some money and they'll go out and smash someone's face in? What do you do in order to tackle injustices done against you? And the media gives a very glamorous, a very perhaps lopsided point of view as to how these systems work. If you met gangsters in real life, they're very rarely as glamorous and as stylish and as charming as the acted version on the TV screen or the film screen is. So it's a view of reality, not necessarily a completely accurate view of reality, but it shapes our understanding. Skinner, and he's sort of building upon his arguments around punishment and so on, again says you've got to understand the limitations of punishment. It can work in the short term, but in the longer term what you tend to get is what he refers to as counterattack. So you've punished someone, and rather than saying, oh, I will never do that naughty thing again, they say, I hate the sight of you and I will do it again just to get at you, but I'll do it in a much cleverer way. And so they dig their heels in. They become a more difficult person to handle. If it's an adult rather than a child, you might be looking at someone who becomes a recidivist, a repeated criminal. So no matter how many times they get caught and sent to prison or made to do community service or whatever, they'll go out and commit more crimes again and again, almost as a way of sticking two fingers up at society. And they'll refine their crimes so that they hope not to get caught again, so they'll try and work out how not to make the same mistake twice in a row. Does positive reinforcement work better? Encouraging good behaviour. So if we started from the school level upwards, and there was a reward system, primary schools certainly do, their gold stars on the chart and all that kind of thing, that every time someone does something good, they get a small reward for it, and that the idea is not only encourages them, but also the other kids who have witnessed them being rewarded for the good behaviour will also want to have a go at doing the good thing. Would that system work? Obviously it doesn't work for every child, because you always get some children who don't play the game for whatever reason. But would it work at a larger scale? You get some companies who have things like Employee of the Month, where they'll put someone's photo up and maybe give them a voucher or some kind of small reward for being a hard-working employee. Does that encourage everyone else in the company to want to follow suit? Or do they just get resentful and think of that person as a bit of a goody two-shoes and slack off all the more? Does reinforcement work well for adults or just children? Does it sometimes create resentment? There's various issues we can explore and deal with when we meet up. But putting behaviourism to one side, we'll move on to cognitivism. The two chaps in the photo, Aaron Beck is on the left in the with a bow tie, and Albert Ellis on the right with the open-necked shirt. They didn't work together initially. They didn't collaborate until they were quite elderly, but they had very similar ideas to each other. Not completely the same, but very similar. Aaron Beck developed CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, and Albert Ellis developed REBT, rational emotive behavioural therapy, which again are quite similar to each other, although not exactly the same. As forms of therapy, they were mainly for treating people with psychological, emotional or psychiatric issues rather than criminal inclinations, but they have been used in prisons to address criminal behaviour, particularly where criminal behaviour is fuelled by maybe underlying mental health issues. If not caused by them, at least added to, contributed to by those mental health issues. Their general argument, again not specifically about crime but about life in general, was that people often develop what they refer to as dysfunctional belief systems. Bizarre views about the world, or if not bizarre, at least unhealthy, dysfunctional views about the world that lead them to undermine themselves, undermine their own life, create their own problems, even if they feel those problems are that they blame other people. Both Beck and Ellis argued actually most of the time we create our own problems and then blame other people for them. A schema is a way of viewing the world, a way of organising your thoughts about a particular subject. And arguably we have schema about everything. We have a schema in our heads as to what a dog is and what different types of dogs are and how to behave towards dogs and what dogs eat. Is basically knowledge and information about a particular subject is a schema about that subject, which will include any subject you care to imagine, including schema around crime. A self-defeating schema is a view of yourself and a view of your life, which sets out to achieve one thing, but manages to destroy the very thing it's setting out to achieve, because that schema does not work well. It defeats itself, or we defeat ourselves, simply by the way we view the world. Both Beck and Ellis argue you want to change someone's behaviour, let's say criminal behaviour in this example, well, you've got to change the way they think. You've got to address how they view the world, change their thought processes, then you can see that their behaviour will change as a consequence. Whereas the behaviourists, Skinner and so on, focus on the behavioural end rather than on the belief end. So these chaps, Beck and Ellis, are coming to it from the opposite angle, if you like, than Skinner came at it from. So Beck developed the cognitive triad. This is for people who are dysfunctional thinkers, someone who's got a very positive view of the world. Well, you just have the same thing, except you'd be changing the word negative to the word positive. And so you've got these three factors that feed into each other constantly. So negative views about yourself. Let's say someone believes themselves to be useless and worthless. So we'll go right back to what we were saying at the start with the humanists and negative self-image, negative self-worth. Why does that person think that they're useless and stupid and awful? Well, both the humanists and Beck and Ellis would say that it's because often you've been told it and told it and told it and told it so many times by someone you admire, someone you love, someone very influential in your life, particularly if they kept telling you that thing when you were very young and therefore more, well, impressionable, more gullible, less capable of defending yourself from their points of view. But by the time you're an adult and you're going into therapy, you have internalised that view of yourself, even if it started from somebody else, let's say a parent or an aunt, an uncle, a next door neighbour, whoever. They may have started describing you in that way, but 20, 30 years later, you are now describing yourself in that way. And saying, oh, I can't do anything, I'm stupid, I'm useless, I'm ugly, I'm this, I'm that, I'm the other. Coupled with that is a mistrust of the world at large. So you're afraid of the world, you're fearful of the world, you see it as a dangerous place in some respects. And with that goes a fear of the future. So not only am I useless and ugly and awful now, and the world is a frightening, awful place now, but it will continue to be a frightening, awful place in the future, and I will continue to be ugly and useless and awful and stupid and blah, blah, blah in the future. If you've got hope that things will change, that my life is miserable today, but it will be so much better tomorrow, then you would be able to cope much more effectively. So that notion that the future will stay the same or indeed get worse is perhaps the real cornerstone of this, because it takes away hope. And without hope, there is no opportunity for improving a situation for it to get better. And so part of what Beck does, what did when he was alive, was to try and instill hope in his clients, in his people he was offering therapy to, that their future could be better, that they could become better people in the future than they were today, that the world would become a nicer place in the future than it was today. And so they had something to work towards, and that kind of motivated them to get going. So put this in a criminal context. Somebody might have a view of themselves in which they think the only thing they're any good at is violence. They're no good at anything else, but they're big and they're beefy and they can punch people. That's about all they're good at. Anything else they're no good at. So they've got a fairly negative view of themselves. How do they see the world where there's all these other people who've got loads of money and they don't deserve it, and they're awful people? And so if Fred has to go and thump a few of them and nick their purses and their wallets, well, they deserve it. They've got no right to the money. The only good thing he's got going for himself is his muscle power, so he'll use that and beat people up and mug them and nick their money. What's he going to do tomorrow? Same thing he's done today. Will he ever be good at anything else? No. Will other people ever have a right to their money? Will the world ever be a nicer place that's got a more useful role for him to play in it than just being a mugger and a villain? No. His life will be as rubbish tomorrow, next month, next year, next decade as it is today. And it will just go on and on and on and on and on until maybe he gets caught and put in prison, and then it will get worse. So there's no incentive for him to change in that perception. Beck also talks about people having these ways of thinking, which he calls dysfunctional ways of thinking. There's more than just the 6 on the screen, but we'll be here forever if we try to cover everything he said. These are the 6 really common ones, not just for criminals, for all sorts of people with unhappy lives. And again, we learn to think about the world in this way by learning from others, usually when we're young, because again, parents and other adults around us who make a big impression on us, and so they think in a certain way and we start to think in that same way too, and then we do it for year after year after year until we become adults, and then we don't even realise we are thinking in that way anymore because it's become second nature. And it's the job of the therapist to step in and say, whoa, stop. Do you realise this is how you're thinking? Do you realise that thinking in that way is making your life as miserable as it is now? Do you realise other people, happy people, think differently? Do you realise that you could think differently as well? And so it begins the process of therapy and change. So selective abstraction is when you focus on one issue and it's not necessarily the best issue to focus on, it's maybe irrelevant or not particularly significant, but you leap to a conclusion based on something that fits a pre-existing point of view anyway. So let's say you got somebody walking down a corridor. So let's say Mary is walking down a corridor at the college. Mary's a student, for argument's sake. She walks down the corridor at the college and she passes a group of 4 or 5 teenage girls in a corner, in a huddle, chatting to each other, and they burst out laughing. Why are those teenage girls laughing? It could be anywhere. They could be telling each other jokes. They could be talking about a TV program they saw last night. They could be laughing for any one of 100 different reasons. But Mary selectively abstracts the fact that they laughed as she walked past. Therefore, she leaps to the conclusion that they must have been laughing at her because they think she looks weird, or she's dressed badly, or she walks in a funny way or something. And so she takes it very personally and she feels embarrassed. because those nasty girls must have been laughing at her. They might have been, of course, but they could have been laughing for any one of 100 other reasons that's nothing to do with Mary, but Mary has selectively abstracted that because it fits her negative self-image. She thinks people laugh at her anyway, and so this becomes yet one more piece of evidence that people don't like her, they laugh at her, they mock her, they ridicule her, they're cruel, they're nasty, which is the view of the world. Not just that she is someone worth laughing at, but that other people are nasty and cruel and vindictive. And so it reinforces those patterns of thinking that she has about herself, about the world, and the worry that, you know, if she walks past the same girls tomorrow, they will laugh at her again tomorrow. So reinforcing her views of the future as well. Minimization is where something positive happens and the significance of it is reduced. It's made irrelevant. So let's say, stick with Mary again, she's walking past that group of girls and they smile and they look happy. Are they smiling at her? Well, maybe they like what she's wearing or something like that. But she says, oh, well, it doesn't matter because they'll be horrible again to me tomorrow. This was a fluke, it's a one-off, it's pure chance. She hands in an essay, gets a really good grade for it. Oh, it's fluke. Or the teacher felt sorry for me, so they overinflated the grade. It doesn't mean anything. So the bad stuff gets exaggerated and the good stuff gets reduced and downplayed. And it reinforces this miserable view of the world. Personalization is the process of taking on board blame for something that's not actually your fault anyway. So let's say a relative dies from an illness, and the individual must stick with Mary. She feels to herself, oh, my grandfather has died because God hates me. This is a punishment on me. It's my fault my grandfather has died, even though it's nothing to do with it. He was just old and ill when he died, and he would have died anyway, no matter what. But somehow it's her fault. Somehow it's her responsibility. And so she dislikes herself even more than she did, and she sees the world as an even more worrying, frightening, unpleasant place than she did before. And she takes everything on board without any real basis of sense to it. Arbitrary inference is a little bit similar to selective abstraction, and it's leaping to conclusions again, but this time with virtually no evidence for the conclusion being leapt to. So let's say perhaps a lot of the online conspiracy theories that are bandied around often involve a lot of arbitrary inference. Something very minor happens and it becomes evidence for a global conspiracy, when in fact it's probably nothing to do with that whatsoever, because it's exaggerated and some grandiose conclusion is leapt to from nothing whatsoever. Hypochondriacs often engage in arbitrary inference, so that they get a minor headache and they see that as evidence that they must have a brain tumour, when all it is a very minor passing headache. So they take something very tiny and irrelevant and blow it into great significance and leap to some conclusion that's not justified by the evidence, which is not dissimilar to the process of magnification, taking a trivial thing and making it into the most dramatic issue going. It becomes this huge, over-the-top concern. They tell a joke to a room full of people and everyone laughs except one person sitting at the back of the room. Why has that one person not laughed? And the individual telling the joke convinces themselves it's because their joke was unbelievably offensive, or it was stupid, or it was not funny, and they have no comedic talent whatsoever. The fact that everyone else in the room laughed becomes irrelevant, it's minimised. The fact that one person in the room didn't laugh is magnified. And there could, again, like the girls in the corridor, there could be all sorts of reasons why they didn't laugh. Maybe they weren't even listening to the joke in the first place. Maybe their mind was on other things. Maybe they just didn't understand the joke. There could be all sorts of reasons, but it's turned into the worst thing that's happened to them that day. That one person not laughing, it becomes magnified and blown out of proportion. In a similar vein, the notion of overgeneralization is taking a one-off event and using it to determine the course of your life. So the very first essay you hand in doesn't get a terribly good grade, and you immediately quit the course because you're thick and useless and awful, and you'll always get bad grades for everything ever that you do. All based on one bad grade for one piece of work with nothing to compare it to. That is overgeneralization. One small thing happens, suddenly everything is terrible. Fred asks a woman out on a date and she says no thanks, and from that he concludes that no woman ever will be interested in him romantically. They all hate him, and all women are terrible and awful and dreadful because they'll all be just like that one woman he's bumped into at a pub and asked for a date, and she said no. That's overgeneralization, going from one instant to this big grandiose view of the world. Why do people do that? Because it fits their pre-existing self-image, it fits their pre-existing understanding of what the world is like. Unhealthy, unhelpful, but common. And this is an argument that both Beck and Ellis put forward with their slightly differing takes on dysfunctional thinking, that dysfunctional thinking is incredibly common. Loads and loads and loads of people engage in dysfunctional thinking, and it becomes a challenge to find people who think well, who think positively of themselves, of the world, of their future. When he was developing rational emotive behavioural therapy, he came up with this notion that the therapist and the client together should go through these 6 steps, A, B, C, D, E and F, in understanding that events that have happened. So let's go back to Mary in the corridor where she thinks the group of teenagers were laughing at her. So A is adversity. So Mary and her therapist sit down and they talk about this, and the therapist says to Mary, why are you so upset today? And Mary says, I walked past this group of girls and they laughed at me. That's the adversity, that's identifying the event that's happened that has upset Mary. And the therapist says to her, why did that upset you? And she says, well, clearly those horrible, stupid girls were laughing at me because I had my hair done the day before, and it's ridiculous and it's an awful haircut and it makes me look ludicrous, and I was wearing this set of clothes and obviously they're really horrible clothes, and so they were laughing at me because they think I look awful. And the therapist will say, well, did you ask them if that was why they were laughing at you? And Mary says, oh no, I just ran away and cried in the toilet for an hour. I didn't speak to them at all. So, in other words, Mary has no real knowledge of why those girls were laughing. She has a belief about why they were doing it, but no knowledge. And her belief could be an entire figment of her imagination. In fact, those girls might not even have noticed her walking past in the corridor. They may have been so busy in their conversation they didn't realise she was there, so they certainly weren't laughing at her. But Mary believes they were. And this is the point of REBT, that it's not so much what happens to us in life as it is our beliefs about why it's happened. And those beliefs are internal to us, not integral to the event itself. So let's say I'm walking through town this afternoon on my way to the next class, and someone punches me. Now, did that person punch me because I deserved it, or did they punch me because they were a complete pig? So in one version it's my fault, and in the other version it's their fault. And depending on whether I think this horrible event, this adversity, is my fault or the other person's fault, will totally change how I react to it. In one, I'm taking on blame and guilt and feeling even worse about myself than I felt when I got punched, and in the other version I'll be maybe angry and outraged and blame that other person, say, what a moron you are, how dare you go around punching people. There's something wrong with you, as opposed to there's something wrong with me. So that's this notion. Belief is a real key critical issue. What are the consequences, the C, consequences of Mary's beliefs? Well, she locked herself in the toilet and cried for an hour. That's one of the immediate consequences of her beliefs. Maybe she felt rubbish for the rest of the day or the week or the month or however long she was thinking about it for. There are a set of consequences that come from automatically believing that anyone laughing is laughing at you. And so the therapist helps Mary identify that the misery she felt locked in the loo for an hour is not necessarily the fault of the group of girls in the corridor. It's more to do with her beliefs than anything else. It's then the job of the therapist to highlight disputes. What are the disputes? Well, the disputes are alternative ways of thinking about the adversity, the belief and the consequences. So Mary's got her set of beliefs, her experiences. The therapist can say, well, what about this? Well, suppose those girls were laughing at a joke they were telling each other. Suppose they hadn't even seen you. Suppose even if some horrible person does laugh at you, it doesn't mean you deserve it. Maybe they're just a snotty, nasty person. What are the alternative ways of thinking about this situation? What are the other ways of addressing? And there might not be just one other way, there could be a whole series of other ways of thinking about the situation that's happened and what it led to and what you should do about it. So it's the job of the therapist to raise other ways of thinking, chiefly because most people are so sunk in their own way of thinking, they're not good at looking at alternatives. And so it needs a therapist or a really good friend or the vicar or a doctor or somebody or another to come into a situation and say, hang on a minute, what if this other idea is true? What if you're mistaken and this other way of thinking about the situation is true? What about that? Introducing new ideas will lead, hopefully, to E, effective new beliefs and philosophies. So the therapist tries to get Mary to take on board the idea that most people are probably not laughing at her, probably not even paying attention to her for that matter, and therefore she shouldn't feel bad every time some random person laughs. It's not about her. And so she starts to think about the world in a different way. By changing her thinking, it then changes her feelings. So we're on to F. So the next time, let's say in a month's time, she walks past some other person who laughs, or group of people who laugh. By that stage, she's thinking to herself, oh, I wonder what joke they've just told each other that's making them laugh. Instead of thinking, oh God, they're laughing at me. And so she starts to think about it in a different way. Now that potentially could be applied to criminal issues as well, where we could start thinking about a situation that happens to someone. So let's say, I can't remember what name I use now, Jack. Let's go for Jack this time. Jack asks a woman out on a date and she says, no thanks, you're ugly, I'm not interested. That's an adversity. The kickback, the being told, I'm not interested, go away. You're ugly. How does he respond to that? Well, maybe if he's a bit criminally inclined, he responds by getting really angry and punching him. And he ends up in court for GBH or ABH or whatever. Could he, what's his beliefs? If somebody says to you, you're ugly, do you go, oh my God, I'm ugly, do you believe it? Do you take it on board? Or do you go, how bloody rude? What a stupid, I'm lovely, I am. You must be short-sighted. Or there must be something wrong with you to think that or to say that. In other words, is the problem me or is the problem them? And so the belief again could be addressed there, and that might lead to a different consequence. So instead of punching the person, the woman who's told him he's ugly to him to go away, he reacts differently. He laughs it off. He says, oh, you must be short-sighted, you ought to go to Specsavers, or whatever he says, and he goes off feeling better. So he can move from a criminal consequence to a non-criminal consequence of how he reacts the next time he gets a slapdown, a negative reaction to his proposal of going out on a date. And so again, it maybe changes how he thinks about specific women, or how he thinks about women in general, different beliefs, different new views of the world. And so everyone is going to have to handle a bit of adversity at some point in their life, but it's changing how he will react to future adversity, so he doesn't react in the criminal way he reacted in the past. It's not necessarily going to work for everyone. Clearly, if we're looking at someone who is a serial killer and a cannibal, chatting about feelings and adversity and beliefs might not really dent the scale of the problem that's going on there. So it might work much better, REBT, for some forms of problem than for other forms of problem, which are perhaps much more deep-rooted and dramatic and require something far more serious than just chatting about how we think about the world. But it could solve, potentially, a fairly large range of issues. Potentially. So if we're thinking about dysfunctional thinking patterns, we have 3 dysfunctional thinking patterns highlighted, and the quotes that you're going to see on this and the next 2 screens are symbolic. They're kind of the description used in REBT for how people think in these ineffective ways. So it's not to say everyone will say word for word this, but they'll be thinking something a bit similar, a bit along this line. So, dysfunctional pattern number 1, I absolutely must, under practically all conditions and at all times, perform well, or outstandingly well, and win the approval or complete love of significant others. If I fail in these important and sacred respects, that is awful, and I am a bad, incompetent, unworthy person who will probably always fail and deserves to suffer. So someone who wants respect, as per that little photo there, that's Tom Hardy playing one of the Cray twins in the film called Legendary. I think some of you may have seen that. About valuing respect and nothing else. So the need for respect, the need for love, for admiration. So the one person who doesn't laugh at the joke is not showing respect, is not admiring, is not approving, or at least you don't think they are at any rate, and then that becomes a big dramatic issue. So everyone is going to have days where you have maybe an argument with someone you love, and they tell you you're a pain in the neck, or you're not behaving in the way they want you to behave, or they might say something a bit catty to you or unpleasant. And so everyone has those days where someone who is significant in your life is not giving you 100% approval, or admiring you, adoring you, doting upon you, loving you in every shape, size and manner. Most of us will be able to cope with those days when we're not feeling the love. But some people don't cope with those days. Some people react really badly, and they internalise that quite dramatically, and so they feel terrible and awful and dreadful. They might react by withdrawing into themselves and possibly harming themselves in some way, or they might explode with anger and rage and resentment. So it could go in all sorts of different directions as to quite what they do next, but they're not going to react well in either direction. Challenging this is the idea for the therapist to introduce to their client the notion that you don't have to be loved every minute of every day by the important people in your life. If they have bad days, or days where you have a falling out with each other or whatever, you can survive that, you can live with that, and things will probably get better in the future. It's not the end of the world just because somebody doesn't much like you today because you've annoyed them or done whatever, or they're in a bad mood or whatever it is that's going on. You can survive it. It's not the end of the universe. But for some people, they act as if it was. And it can become a real major issue. And this becomes a critical issue, particularly in codependent relationships, where maybe one partner is very bullying and abusive, and the other partner will bend over backwards to get their approval and do things that they probably shouldn't really be doing, put up with things that they shouldn't really put up with in order to curry favour, because they can't cope with the idea of not being loved and approved of and so on by that person that they're dependent on. For thinking pattern number 2, I'm hoping no one recognises the women in the photo. Just nick that off the internet. Two women bashing each other up. Other people with whom I relate or associate absolutely must, under practically all conditions and at all times, treat me nicely, considerately and fairly. Otherwise it is terrible, and they are rotten, bad, unworthy people who will always treat me badly and do not deserve a good life and should be severely punished for acting so abominably to me. Now, whereas thinking pattern number 1 is most likely to internalise the viewpoints and feel really bad themselves because so-and-so doesn't love them, for dysfunctional pattern number 2, the individual is more likely to explode outwards than inwards. They still potentially could go internalised, but they're more likely to externalise. And so it's more likely to end up punching someone's face in and ripping their wig off their head and all the kind of things going on in that photo there. Because somebody said something, did something, looked at you a bit funny, failed to show you the level of consideration and concern and devotion and respect that you want, and so they have to get it in the neck, because having betrayed you once, they are then written off forevermore. And so people with dysfunctional thinking pattern number 2 tend to be very unforgiving. One mistake and they will hold it against you for ever and a day. Even if it wasn't an intentional mistake, even if it was a kind of an accidental slight, nonetheless it will be counted against you in the long run. And obviously thinking pattern number 2 could easily get involved in the kind of criminal action, the bit of ABH going on there in the photo, in lashing out, in hurting people, beating them up, killing them, robbing from them, doing horrible things to them, burning their house down, whatever. Whereas thinking pattern number 2 is more likely to engage in criminal activities as a way of ingratiating themselves with a more bullying personality, a more domineering personality, a way of trying to win approval. Either, and I say domineering personality, it could be as to the sort of common teenage situation where someone is showing off to a gang of mates to impress them, and they go and do something stupid trying to impress. So it's not necessarily that the group of friends is bullying them into doing anything. It's just that their desperate need to impress might lead them to do something quite stupid and criminal. But again, it's that need for affection, for love, for respect. I've got to be wanted, I've got to be liked, I've got to be popular, that leads people into those sorts of problems. And that's not, pattern number 2 is still about being popular, but it's more of an outward explosion, whereas the first one usually is an inward explosion, occasionally outward. And finally, can't even say that word, dysfunctional thinking pattern number 3. The conditions under which I live absolutely must, at practically all times, be favourable, safe, hassle-free, and quickly and easily enjoyable. And if they are not that way, it's awful and horrible, and I can't bear it. I can't ever enjoy myself at all. My life is impossible and hardly worth living. This pattern is least likely to be associated with crime, but very highly likely to be associated with that kind of paper-thin, hypersensitive, histrionic predilection for drama. So one thing goes wrong and they're wailing and screaming and rolling about on the floor, and life is the most awful, terrible thing ever, and their demands for attention skyrocket and become unmanageable, and they're a bit of a melodrama waiting to happen. A very kind of stroppy teenage, moody, my boyfriend, girlfriend's been rotten to me, therefore my life is over forevermore, and I'm going to lock myself in the bedroom for the next 6 months, talking about the fact. Usually they do eventually get over it. It's not as likely to result in crime. but certainly in a lot of melodrama and a lot of histrionics and making other people's lives a bit of a misery. Along with irrational belief becomes a process of difficult behaviour. And 4 particular features of this are identified. The demand that everything go well for you is very much part of that third dysfunctional thinking pattern there. Everything's got to be instantly successful, instantly brilliant, instantly good, and everyone's got to be fair to me and kind to me and right to me and just to me, and if they're not, I've got to make a real kind of melodrama of it. And both Ellis and Beck suggest that life generally is not fair. People are often a bit rude, a bit blunt, a bit selfish, a bit this, a bit that, and often not very nice to us. And for the most part, we've just got to kind of go with it and just get on with life and stop making such a drama out of everything. But not everyone can. A lot of people, and we might speculate as to whether social media and so forth has an impact in terms of increasing the percentage of people who think like this, scream, rant and rage and really react in a very excessive fashion when they perceive some form of injustice happening to themselves. Awfulizing, which is one of these peculiar words that American therapists tend to dream up, goes with, again, thinking pattern number 2, number 3, and to an extent number 1 as well. This tendency to wildly blow everything out of proportion. One small thing has gone wrong, everything is dreadful, everything is awful, everything has to be destroyed. So the world is a little bit wrong in some respect. Therefore, the whole of society must be burnt to the ground and replaced with something completely and utterly new, rather than simply changing that one little bit of society. And you end up with everything is kind of wildly over the top. Low frustration tolerance is what I suppose is often referred to these days as that kind of snowflake mentality of needing safe spaces and everything's got to be precious, which again both Beck and Ellis says is not a good approach to life, because life is full of frustrations and unfairnesses and adversities and problems, and to survive in the world you've just got to develop a thick skin and get on with it. So if every time something goes wrong you collapse into a heap, and therefore you demand other people prevent things from going wrong, or provide you with all sorts of rather bizarre protections to surround yourself with, if the least little thing happens, then you're not going to manage well in life. Depreciation is, again, tying in with those earlier notions that somebody gets one low grade on an essay and they just give up completely on the course because I can't do anything anymore because I feel so undervalued because this one thing has happened, and they feel as if somehow they're totally invalidated as a human being because of one minor thing that's gone wrong. Someone has not spoken to me in the way I want them to speak to me, therefore my life is over, and I'm a worthless human being because of this one little thing. It's very over the top and makes life difficult for that person to function. To what extent this applies to crime we can perhaps discuss in a future class. There may be some examples that leap to mind as we've gone along. Certainly it was mainly developed to understand people who end up in therapy rather than people who end up in prison, but you might be able to think of ways in which this can apply to criminal scenarios. And that brings us to the end of this week, which I'm sure will be a relief for your ears as well as my throat. So next week we'll move into looking at sociological theories. So some of the names we've mentioned today and last time, Gramsci and Sutherland, some of that we'll be coming back to, but also a number of other sociological theories that put crime into the big picture perspective of understanding large-scale problems that happen rather than trying to work out the individual issues within the mind of a particular criminal. So it's kind of big picture stuff rather than small picture approach. But if you've got any questions, you can either email them to me, or if you prefer to wait till the next class and raise them then and discuss them and we can bounce ideas around with each other, that's perfectly fine too. But let's hope the trains are running properly next week and I can actually get there and see you in person. Take care for now. Bye bye.